So I don't know if you heard me before. Let me introduce myself again. My name is Dimitris Vlassopolos. I'm glad that I'm here with you today, albeit that I'm remote, to give you an overview of a new product, Cisco product that we call the Crosswalk Workflow Manager. I do understand that I'm standing between you and the rest of your evening, so I'll try and keep this short and concise. What we will do is we'll go over the product. I'll give you a product overview. We'll discuss some of the basic concepts and components, and we'll end up by giving a demonstration. We'll navigate a bit the user interface of the product, and we'll execute a couple of workflows so you get a feeling of what the product is all about. So what is the Crosswalk Workflow Manager? It is a microservices design solution that lives on top of a Kubernetes container orchestration system. As the product name alludes to, the solution is aimed at providing a platform for executing workflows. At its core, it uses a domain-specific language which has been purposely defined for the execution of workflows. The language is vendor neutral and it offers constructs that you would typically expect to find in a workflow solution. One of the fundamental goals for the product has always been to deliver a scalable, high performance, and reliable platform. Now, for anybody that wants to, learn more about the domain-specific language, there's a link there. I'm sure most of you are aware of it. Now, this diagram shows the system architecture for the platform. As I mentioned, Kubernetes provides the fundamentals for the product infrastructure, where the core Crosswalk Workflow Manager software components live and cater for the solution. Some of the product components are to be delivered or created by the end users of the products, and these regard to some of the adapters and obviously the workflow definitions. Workflow definitions are customer specific, and they do represent the business processes and use cases that are more than often very unique to the needs in their environments. The adapters required to facilitate these workflows might need to be developed by the customer or a partner with the aid of the adapter software developer kit that we will talk about later on, or by leveraging community content. So let's just look into these components with more detail. All system interactions are initiated at the northbound REST programmatic interface. The REST API allows for full control over the workflow manager, both from an administrative perspective, but also from an operations standpoint. The control server is the starting point for initiating and executing system activities. It is responsible for dispatching work to the appropriate microservices within the solution. Next, we have the workflow engine. The workflow engine is in essence your workflow conductor. Within this space, the workflow definitions are interpreted and executed. These definitions are specified in JavaScript object notation, JSON, and they do adhere to the serverless workflow specification that I was discussing earlier. Currently, these workflows are authored directly in JSON using a source code editor, an integrated development environment such as Visual Studio. A future release of the product will incorporate a comprehensive graphical studio for your design. Now, all southbound east-west integrations are carried out by the adapters. The adapters are responsible for all communication aspects with other applications, systems, and environments. The adapters define and expose activities that are then consumed by the workflow definition and are designed to perform a series of actions against the target system, again, whether it's an application or a solution. Each and every adapter is associated with a worker. This worker is responsible for executing the workflow code itself, the relevant code, adapter code, and the activities that are defined in the workflow. An administrator will manage the creation of the workers and will associate the adapter activities to these workers. And we will see this in a bit more detail once we navigate the product user interface. But in essence, it's the adapters that are responsible for communicating with the external systems, and it is the workers that carry out that work for us. For those of us that are familiar with NSO, it is not equivalent to a NED in what aspect? And it is very, very, very specific about the target system that it operates against. And it exposes a model within the NSO solution. With the adapters, what we get is a set of activities that we can consume in our workflow definitions. But by no means is this a model like we get from a NED. Now, users will be able to create their own integrations based on their environment needs with the aid of the adapter SDK. So the product will ship with an adapter SDK that allows for the creation of these workers. It's pretty much similar to NSO's make package functionality. The SDK will automatically generate a structure of the required components, directories, pre-populated files, etc. And at that point, a developer can go inside and further define the integration activities that are needed. Eventually, the SDK allows you to generate an adapter file that you can then import into the Crosswork Workflow Manager, thus extend the capabilities of integration in your environment. So at this point, I don't have any more things to cover about the product itself. I think it might be a bit too much. Let's go into the environment and navigate around the UI, and we will be able to execute a couple of workflows. I'll just show you one of the workflows that I intend to execute today. It's rather long in the sense that it has to go through a series of steps. The intent is to deploy an instance on an Amazon on EC2 on Amazon, then register that system within the Crossworks network controller, but also register it with NSO so we can then incorporate it into our environment. So let me just quickly switch monitors. Okay, now I've already logged into the workflow manager. As you can see, the look and feel for those that have worked with the Crossworks suite is pretty similar. There are a number of panes on the left-hand side that I can select from. I have in the admin component at this point, let me just refresh my screen because I might have logged out. Sorry. Excuse me, let me just quickly check my connectivity. Well, I'm back. Sorry, apologies for that delay. My connectivity timed out. So we're in the product. As I mentioned, the look and feel resembles that of the Crossworks suite. There are a number of panels on the left-hand side that allow you to navigate the various functional areas of the product. We will start from the admin view at this point. And what you can see here is the workers that are currently running in the environment that I'm using. So we have 4 workers which correspond to 4 adapters. I should mention at this point that the product will ship with 2 adapters, namely the Cisco NSO adapter and the generic REST adapter, the first 2 ones. The other 2 were developed using the SDK for the purposes of this demonstration. So from this view, users have the ability to create their own adapters, and I'll just show you quickly an example of that. You will be able to start and stop adapters as you please. When you do so, that means that any pending actions will execute, but the adapter itself, the worker itself, will no longer accept any new connections. So it's a way that you can pause executions of workflows. Each and every adapter shows the activities that it exposes within the workflow system. And these are specific activities that you can leverage in your workflow definitions. There is documentation around the activities of the adapters that we will ship and how you can leverage them within a workflow definition. Similarly, you can create a new one and you can explicitly decide whether you want to include functionality from various adapters. And that way you can create a worker that is targeted for a very specific use case. And you can also ensure that any workloads are isolated in that worker for that particular purpose. Now, in this view, as the product will ship, I have an earlier development environment that doesn't show everything. You will be able to define users. You will be able to define your secrets that you will use to interface with your target systems. You will be able to create resources, which in essence means a target system and associate a secret with it. But in this view, the only thing that we can do at this point from the user interface is work with adapters. Let's have a quick look at the workflows. The workflows, sorry, my connectivity issues are continuing. There we go. Apologies for that. So again, in the workflow tabs, you define your workflows. You can store your workflows within the environment. You can version your workflows. You can look at each and every workflow just by clicking on it and looking at the JSON code that I was mentioning earlier that adheres to the domain-specific language, the serverless workflow definition. There is currently no studio environment in the product. You will have to author these workflows using an external source code system. I'll show you an example of that. I particularly use Visual Code. But what you do have here is the entirety of the workflows that you can install in your system. You can edit as we did right now, or you can execute a workflow directly from this environment. Let's look at a couple of executions. Every time when you instantiate a workflow, it creates a job. And within the jobs pane, you can see all the workflows that have executed for the system at this point, those that have completed successfully, those that have been canceled for whatever reason, either because they came across an error or because the user decided to terminate them. The views in the environment can be filtered. You have filters at the very top, so you could be looking at very specific workflows. I want to see anything I executed against a particular job name. You can decide which columns you want available in your environment, typical things that you would find in a user interface. Now, the product also ships with a Swagger interface that allows you to take complete control of the system. Whatever hasn't made it into the user interface at this point of time, and again, as I mentioned, I'm using a development environment, a pre-release development environment. The Swagger UI exposes everything. So if you want to interface with the system programmatically, there are examples here that cover everything that the system is capable of doing so at the moment. So you can define your workflows, you can create your workers, you have the ability to create secrets and resources, which again are related to the target systems that you want to connect to. The jobs refer to the workflows that have been instantiated, and the adapters are the software components that provide the integrations with other systems. So before I execute a workflow, let's just look at one that I did earlier. As I drill down into the job, you will see a series of events that demonstrate the steps, that actually illustrate the steps that the workflow engine had to go through in order to satisfy the definition of the workflow. And once again, apologies, I am having some connectivity issues. In the meantime, while that system comes back online, as I mentioned, the workflow will instantiate a router on EC2 on AWS. Right now, at this point, I don't have a router in my environment. Similarly, if I look at the network devices that I have within Crossworks, which is also experiencing delays. And once more, apologies. I seem to be back. I will take this opportunity at least to execute the workflow, and you can hopefully follow through. I apologize again for all the interruptions. As I mentioned, in my environment, there is no instance running on Amazon. I have a number of devices within NSO. They're all named Node 1 to 92, nothing else. And furthermore, I do have a WebEx Teams setup, where we'll be able to see some messages as the workflow executes. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and fire it up. So I will need to deliver a payload for this particular workflow as it is expecting some input from the user. There are a number of parameters that I provide here, and they're related to the Amazon AMI, actually the image that I want to instantiate, and a couple of other things that the workflow will use to connect the systems in the backend environments. So let me just quickly try and run this job. Sorry, let me do that again. And if I look at the job manager, I can already see that this has started to execute. I will switch briefly to the WebEx environment, and hopefully soon we will start seeing some messages that will notify us of the execution of the workflow in the backend. And again, once more, move quickly back to the workflow and see the execution of this. For some reason, this has failed to execute. It might be a connectivity issue. I will attempt to run it once more. And this time it seems to be executing. So here we can see a number of notifications that are popping up as the workflow is executing in the backend, is processed by the CrossWorks Workflow Manager. If I switch over to the respective environments, I refresh on Amazon, I will see that there's an instance that's been instantiated on my behalf. I did add the relevant title of Automation Developer Days just to make sure that I get the right instance running. This will take some time before it becomes available on Amazon. You can see here that it is initializing. So the workflow needs to wait until this step is completed before it can continue with completing its registration on the other systems. It has done partially with the CrossWorks environments. So if I was to look here at network devices, I now see that I have 8 network devices, and this refers to the one that's been instantiated on Amazon. But at this point, there's no connectivity established. It's just a reference point to the device. Similarly, I can see the same information in NSO. So if I'm to refresh this page, I can see the device that's been instantiated. It's being registered with its public IP, and I'm just waiting for that initialization phase to complete on the Amazon side. So I'll be able to sync this device within NSO and hopefully execute some additional services. Now, this briefly covers the workflow aspect that I had in mind. And again, apologies for all the delays. You can see here in detail the steps that the workflow engine is executing in the back end, so it can fulfill the definition of the workflow. In the meantime, while we're waiting for that to complete, let me just quickly go over to what a workflow definition looks like using the JSON notation. As I mentioned earlier, I'm using Visual Studio for developing these workflows. And Visual Studio comes along with a plugin that allows you to visualize the activities, the actions that you defined in your workflow. Here we're looking at something very trivial. It's just a hello world example where we have two states within the workflow execution. We have some very specific, generic parameters defined at the very top. We have two states, one state that will just spit out hello, and the other one will say goodbye. If we're looking at the workflow that I've just executed, it's a bit more comprehensive. There's a number of steps that are involved. And again, you can use this graphical visualizer to validate the steps. The editor by itself will validate the syntax. And as I mentioned, this add-on will allow you to view the activities as you design them. One thing that's worth mentioning in the definition of the workflows for the CrossWorks Workflow Manager, you have the ability to associate compensate actions. And the compensate actions will allow you to revert in the event that you do hit an error as you're processing your workflow. Unlike NSO that has the ability to roll back or to do the service undo, with workflows we have to be far more explicit. And in this particular case, with the CrossWorks Workflow Manager, it allows you to be explicit regarding that. So you can define compensate states inside your workflow definition. In the event that the workflow will hit an error, you can undo all previous actions. So for instance, for the transfer image, in the event that I hit an error somewhere further down, it will remove the image here. And again, I'm compensating at the level where I'm modifying the bootstrap for a device, and I'm also compensating for the event that I'm adding a device to NSO and I would like a particular action to be executed in order to leave my environment in a clean state. Again, it doesn't have the functionality that you get out of NSO, but it is a way of retracing the steps of the execution and reverting those that are necessary. Now, hopefully enough time has passed. No, we're still waiting for some NSO confirmation messages to ensure that the workflow has completed. It does take some time for the images to instantiate on Amazon. But in essence, that's all I had to cover for you for the Workflow Manager. Again, apologies for the disruptions, for the delays. I hope you are still online, or maybe I'm talking to myself. But yeah, I'll stop at this point and see if you have any questions.
Do we have any, oh, wow. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anybody? I mean, we had 19 or actually 20 questions in the previous session, so ending up with 0 here would be a bit of a disappointment. Nobody? Ah, there we go. Very good.
Can a workflow start by triggering by an event and not manually by the user or scheduler?
It definitely can. I'm not really sure that it will be available with this release, but that is definitely the intent. So the workflows can react to events, whether they are internal or external.